How is the perspective of Mrs. Black different from the perspective of Mrs. Manstey? In this lesson, you will learn how an author establishes perspective by distinguishing what is directly stated from what is meant. We are doing a close reading of Mrs. Manstey's View by Edith Wharton. Mrs. Manstey is our main character. We have identified her as being lonely, introverted, and isolated. She prefers to sit by her window looking outside, and she does not interact with others. We've also described her as being delusional. She considers people and things as her friends, even though they have absolutely no regard for her. Now, in this lesson, we are focusing on the character's perspective, but before we can do that, we need to review how to determine the point of view of the text. The point of view is the position of the narrator in relation to the story. So let's review one way that you can figure out the point of view used in a text. The first thing you can do is ask yourself, do you see the words I, me, and my mentioned outside of the dialogue? If you answered yes to the question, then it is written in the first person. If you answered no, then you need to ask yourself, do I see the pronouns you, yours, and your mentioned in the text? If you answered yes, then it is written in the second person. If you answered no, then you have to ask yourself, when I read, do I read about the inner thoughts and feelings of more than one character? If you answered yes to this question, then it is written in the third person omniscient. Remember, an omniscient being is an all-knowing being. If you answer no to this question, then it is written in the third person limited point of view. Now, the third person limited is where the narrator knows only the thoughts and feelings of a single character. Mrs. Manstey's view is written in the third person limited because we only get a detailed description of her thoughts and feelings. Now, regarding perspective, what this means is that Mrs. Manstey's perspective is going to be more directly stated because it is written in the third person limited point of view. And this perspective of other characters will be revealed through inferences. Now, a common mistake that many students make when trying to determine the point of view and perspective of characters is that they want to look at the dialogue. And dialogue alone can be very misleading. In many instances, a character's true feelings or implied meaning, like sarcasm and understatement, can only be identified by looking at how a character speaks. So, when you're trying to identify how the perspective of Mrs. Black is different from the perspective of Mrs. Manstey, we are going to follow 3 steps. First, we will reread the dialogue between characters. Second, we will highlight the words and phrases that describe how the character speaks. And third, we will ask, what does this tell me about the character's perspective? We are going to focus our attention on page 7. This is the point in the story where Mrs. Manstey is confronting Mrs. Black about the extension. We are going to highlight the words and phrases that describe how the character speaks. But I don't want to move. I can't move, said Mrs. Manstey, almost with a scream. Almost with a scream. This emphasizes how much she doesn't want to move. An almost scream would indicate that she really wants Mrs. Black to hear her. It also indicates that she's still in shock and restraining herself a bit. And I came to tell you that if you build that extension, I shall have no view from my window. No view, do you understand? Mrs. Black thought herself face to face with a lunatic, and she had always heard that lunatics must be humored. All right, I'm going to highlight the word lunatic here. This is what Mrs. Black thinks about Mrs. Manstey. This is also important because it directly impacts the way Mrs. Black is going to talk to Mrs. Manstey in the next set of dialogue. Dear me, she remarked, pushing her chair back a little way. That is too bad, isn't it? Why, I never thought of that. To be sure, the extension will interfere with your view, Mrs. Manstey. You do understand, Mrs. Manstey gasped. All right, and then we have the word gasped. When you gasp, you take a sudden short breath because you are shocked. So Mrs. Manstey is shocked that Mrs. Black actually understands her. Now, after highlighting how the character speaks, we can now ask ourselves, what does this tell me about the character's perspective? Well, Let's first define perspective. A perspective is the way an individual looks at situations and facts, and perspectives can vary from one person to another. So, in order to do this, we are going to look at each character separately. First, let's look at Mrs. Black. We highlighted the word lunatic because Mrs. Black thinks that Mrs. Manstein is crazy. Then Wharton says, that lunatics must be humored. Although this statement doesn't describe how Mrs. Black spoke, it does tell us how she is going to speak to Mrs. Manstein from this point further. And to humor someone is to comply in order to make content, and that's exactly what Mrs. Black plans on doing in the next paragraph. By capitalizing the word will, Wharton wants the reader to emphasize or stress this word in order to show that Mrs. Black thinks Mrs. Manstein's logic is completely ridiculous. The tone here is definitely sarcastic. This passage shows that in Mrs. Black's perspective, she is smarter and more logical, thus better than Mrs. Manstein. Remember, Mrs. Manstein is a renter. She is part of the lower class, and Mrs. Black is a landlord, which puts her in the upper class. This scene is indicative of the 19th century social class mindset. Now let's look at Mrs. Manstein. We first highlighted the word almost with a scream. Mrs. Manstein wants to be heard. The tone here is definitely desperation. Mrs. Manstein is desperate for Mrs. Black to see things through Mrs. Manstein's eyes. We also highlighted the word gasped, which means shocked. She can't believe Mrs. Black actually understands her. Now, we know from Mrs. Black's sarcastic tone that she doesn't care about Mrs. Manstein's view. But from Mrs. Manstein's perspective, she has successfully persuaded Mrs. Black not to build her extension. However, as readers who can look beyond what is directly stated on the page, we know that this perspective is incorrect. When you use close reading skills, such as making inferences, you are paving the road for a deeper understanding of the text. So let's step back and review how you can use the words and phrases that describe how a character talks to identify a character's perspective. You can use these same 3 steps in other pieces of literature as well. First, reread the dialogue between characters. Then, highlight the words and phrases that describe how the characters speak. And third, ask, what does this tell me about the character's perspective? In this lesson, you have learned how an author establishes perspective by distinguishing what is directly stated from what is meant.